welcome. Really, really glad to have you here. Super glad that Neon asked me to help with this. I'm really glad to be able to. The session is really like a pretty basic level introduction to different types of fundraising and ways that you can access different sources of money, and hopefully will be quite useful for some of you, not just in the immediate weeks, but in the sort of midterm and longer term as well. Some of this might be useful. So just to start off, really, I suppose I often run this session, like I say, sometimes as a whole day session, sometimes just as a really condensed version in this sort of 90-minute session. And I often run it for lots of different groups. And when I start, I say, I'm not a professional trainer and I'm not a professional fundraiser, but here I am kind of hosting the session and sort of telling you what I do know. But the reason that I know what I know about this part of the world is because I've spent 20 years as a producer and a consultant and a facilitator working mainly in the arts and culture work-wise. I mainly make shows, tours, events, festivals, and those kind of things. Sometimes things like exhibitions, public programs, other stuff. But I've also sort of over the whole of the time that I've been, really from my teenage years right to now, sort of involved in campaigning and activism, particularly around social justice themes, sort of years before, but more recently around healing justice frames, which is relatively new to me, but a new colleague and a client that I'm working with a lot at the moment, who's exploring how to do that locally within Cardiff, and lots of the things that are resonating around that. And I took part in Movement Builders, the Neon session in Cardiff 2 years ago, I think it might have been, which I thought was really great. So if you haven't done Movement Builders and you're interested, I'd highly recommend it. It was a really, really great session. So yeah, so just a tiny sort of intro. Zoom wise, I know that most of us are probably used to Zoom by now, but feel free, don't worry, firstly, if people walk around in the background, if you have pets or kids or housemates or partners, whatever, it's not a problem. Please don't panic. If you have any sort of tech questions like how to view stuff or what to do with the chat or whatever, ask Grace. Grace is here to help. So if there's anything that you need, feel free to do that. Because there's quite a small group of us, if you want to ask a question, feel free to like unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask, or like actually wave is quite a handy way to get my attention. Or if you go in the participants list, there's also a raise hand function, so you can always use that to kind of get my attention or Grace's attention if you've got a question as we're going through. I'll try and pause a couple of times and just check in if there is anything that you particularly want to ask, but also feel free, like I say, unmute yourselves and jump in if you need to. And I'm going to share my screen for a few bits of this just to show you the PowerPoint. So I'm actually just going to start to do that now. So this is me. I'm going to tell you about that in a second, but this is what we're going to do. So I'm going to tell you a really tiny brief bit about me and the session. We're going to look at a really quick list of different types and sources of funding. So we're going to think particularly about different ways that you can access different pots of money and what might be available and useful to you. We're going to do a quick run through, particularly thinking about things like applications that you might make to trusts and foundations, or councils or local authorities or other people who have pots of money and give those away as grants. So we'll do some work around that. Loads of sort of do's and don'ts, tips and tricks along the way, and a couple of bullet points towards the end on a slide about different writing styles and jargon and other things that you might want to think about when you're actually putting together either a letter or an email to get someone support, or writing like a grant process, a grant application. So those kind of things. We'll try and finish up certainly by 6 and hopefully with a few minutes to spare so that you can kind of ask any questions. But like I say, with a group this size, it's quite nice. You can kind of jump in as you need to and share if there's things that you want to know as we go along. It's probably better to ask that rather than wait too long and forget what your question was. So yeah, so I'm just going to stop sharing and give you a tiny introduction. So like I say, I mainly work in the arts and culture, and this session has been developed over the last like 15 years. So very much a session that I've done with all sorts of different groups of people, like I say, professionally and in my kind of voluntary practices. And usually I do this over a whole day, and online we do it over 2 whole sessions. So this is very much a condensed version, and that's why I think it's really useful. You get the materials as well, so you can see the PowerPoint and the handouts, because that's got obviously a lot more information that you can follow up on afterwards. we're not going to have a break. We're just going to kind of plow on through, but totally understand if any of you have to go early or there's, you know, questions as you go through, feel free to let me know so that we can kind of build stuff in as we go. I'm also, before we dive in, I'm just going to say a word about COVID and how COVID is changing fundraising, because I think it would be unwise to assume that everything's normal. As we know, nothing is normal anymore, if normal was even with us before. So as it is, there are lots of things that are at play in the world of fundraising, that some of which are new, some of which are still changing, some of which might flip back to how they were before. We're not sure yet. So as with many sectors of life, I'm just going to give it like a few examples. So we know, for instance, that some of the trusts and foundations that support some of the work that you guys might be doing might be pausing at the moment and not making any applications available because they're struggling to support the existing grantees that they have on their books. Some are starting to repurpose that and are coming up with new schemes that are emergency schemes or urgent schemes to respond to need as they can see it. Some of it we're not sure, like I say, whether it's going to stay that way or whether it will flip back to how it has been in the past, and they'll kind of remove those urgent schemes once they feel that's gone and go back to how things were. I think the bigger point is probably they're going to change again, but we're not quite sure how yet, because many impacts, obviously, at every level, from, you know, individual, societal, financial, economic, every level. So I suspect there are more changes still to come. So the reason of just kind of putting that caveat in there is obviously this session was developed over quite a long time in quite different circumstances. And I'll mention as we go through some of the ways that COVID is changing the things that we're going to talk about. But they may change again, is the kind of caveat. So things I say today might stop being true tomorrow or next week or next month, depending on how the funders respond. I just want to give a couple of examples of that, which might make it a bit more obvious about how some of these things are shifting in the bigger context. So particularly thinking about trusts and foundations that are giving away grants to groups, either at a grassroots level or at the larger organisational and societal levels. But many of them get their money from either assets or investments, and their assets are now worth less than they were 3 months ago. The investments in their stock market are returning less to them than they were 3 months ago, and so on. So you can see that they're kind of being impacted financially about the amount of money they have and therefore what they're giving away. Another really practical example, some of you might have had money in the past or be thinking about money from what used to be called the Big Lottery Fund, which is now the National Lottery Communities Fund that supports community development and local kind of level activities. But we don't know what impact COVID is going to have in the long run on lottery ticket buyers. Because when people play the lottery, that money not just goes to the winner, but it goes to good causes. And those good causes include community development, heritage, sport, the arts, all sorts of other things. And we don't know whether lottery ticket buyers are going to be so impacted individually in terms of the money in their pockets that they will choose not to buy those tickets, and therefore there'll be less money for those good causes. Historically, we know that obviously the more straightened the times are, actually the spike in lottery buying goes up. And so people buy more lottery tickets because they feel they're more desperate to achieve the big wins and the more substantial sums, that they will spend that £2 or that pound on that scratch card in order to get the bigger sense of what is possible for them to accumulate. So it is really unusual times. I can't stress that enough. There's obviously a lot of things that are going to shift. But like I said, a lot of the basics around this, both the bigger context and some of the things that I'm going to offer you about the how to write some of the stuff and the research that you might want to do around funders and funding opportunities, is still true. So I think it's still worth sharing, but like I say, just with all those caveats. Any other questions before we sort of dive in at this stage? We're going to start with a bit of an overview of different types and sources of funding, like where can you get money from and how do you do that? And I'm going to ask you, if you can, to type some ideas of where you do get that money from in the chat box in a second. But anything before we start, like any practical questions or about the material we're going to cover or anything else? Cool, okay. And the only other thing that's helpful just before we set off is like a quick show of hands, like a literal put your hands up if you have your video on. Have you ever written anything to ask anybody to give you any money before? So have you written an email to a supporter or a donor? Have you written like an application to a grant giving body like a foundation or a trust or an arts council or a community development council or something like that? Just to get an idea of like how many people have done some of that stuff? Great, so about like half maybe with the people video on, so it's just really helpful to me get an idea of like the level of people that like starting from never having done that. Great, any questions that you want to ask before we go? Otherwise we're going to start. Great, so I know this is a bit clunky on phones and tablets, so don't worry if you can't do this, but if you're on a laptop and you're able to, it's really helpful if you could open the chat and if you could type in there any ideas about where do you get your money from, or where do people like you or groups like you get your money from. The reason that we're going to do this is just this second bullet point on this slide. So we're just going to go into a section looking at all the different possibilities of funding or fundraising that might be available to you. And it's really nice just to like crowdsource a bit of that from you guys. And I'll tell you about some of the ones that perhaps you don't know, as well as some of the ones that you bring up. So if you've got any thoughts or opinions or offers you want to share in the chat, now is a good time to type in a couple of thoughts, like in answer to actually on the next slide, this question: where do you get your money from, or where does your group or your charity or your association or your campaign or whatever get its money from? Where else could you find some of that funding, and what different types of fundraising are there? So feel free to use the chat if it's useful and you can get into the chat to do that. If you're on a phone or a tablet and it's a little bit more clunky, totally fine. You don't need to join in unless you want. Yep, great. So a few people are already doing that. I'm just going to stop sharing because it's easier just to see you all on the chat at the same time. So amazing list already. This is great. Legacy funds, round tree. Yeah, it could be individual, like people that you actually know the name of, like particular trusts and foundation. It could be like the way that it's described, so like charities or other individuals or whatever. So yeah, that's a good list already coming up. Brilliant. Oh, the European Union one's going to make me cry. We'll start on Brexit in a minute. I said the word Brexit this morning, my audio stopped working on my Zoom, so I don't know if that's just going to keep happening between now and the 31st of December, but hopefully it won't happen today. Great, it's a really good list, guys. Awesome. Keep adding some in there. And I'm just going to note a couple down that I want to draw out particularly, and I'm going to talk you through my long list of, like, in addition to some of the ones you've put up, as well as some that you haven't got any as well. Great. Okay, keep adding to that list if you want to keep adding things up. If you haven't finished typing, that's totally fine. I'm going to just go back up to the start and start really talking through a few of these to give you an idea of like all the options that might be available. So some of these might not work for you. Depends on how you're, to some degree, how you're constituted. If you're an individual, if you're a voluntary association, if you've got a registered charity vehicle, like some of these things might work for you and some might not. But it's just a really neat way to kind of bring a list together. And like I said, there's much more information in the handout that I'm sending you about some of these other options. So yeah, great list. I'm going to run through my list and tick off some of yours as we go. So my first one is potentially, again, really a bit sad. Local authorities still do have pots of discretionary funding in all sorts of places, but I'm pretty sure that we're not that far off a local authority going into the equivalent of administration, even though they can't really do that in the same way. The pressure, obviously, of the last 10 years of austerity, combined with the kind of current pressures they're under, they're really struggling. But that's not to say that they all are. There are some that still do have pots of money available for all sorts of regen, community engagement, all sorts of other stuff. So it's well worth knowing, either in your local area or the area where you operate, whether there are pots of money that you can access through a local authority. I'm going to mention one that I don't think's come up yet in this list, which I've already mentioned, but I work with a lot. So the National Lottery, who fund, because of players playing the National Lottery, fund good causes, including the arts and culture, where I earn most of my professional work. But also they support heritage, they support grassroots sport and elite sport. So you get professional sports people who are funded by the lottery. They fund community development through an organisation called the National Lottery Community Fund, which used to be called the Big Lottery, and some of you might have come across that. So lots of different options there. Worth stating that many of those bodies are 100% funded by the lottery, but some of them also have government money. So it's worth remembering this balance that, say, the Arts Council and the Sports Councils tend to get a bit of money from granting aid from government, direct from Treasury, as well as getting some money from the lottery. So they have mixed income sources there. And the fact that the National Lottery used to be the only lottery, but there are other lotteries in the UK. And again, I've put some links on the handouts that you can look through those. So if you're looking for particularly community-based, local-based, or sometimes thematic like health type activism or campaigning or organisation, that you could look to some of those other lotteries, not just the National Lottery monies, to help support that. European Union, I could honestly cry. I mean, today's the day we're supposed to have asked for a deadline if we want a deadline. I don't think we've asked for a deadline and extension. I think we're crashing out on the 31st of December. I don't know why I'm even smiling. It's horrendous. It's safe to say that the European Union funds are obviously therefore going. And I have put in the handout that I've sent to you a link to one of the things that I use really regularly, which is the Creative Europe desk. I know not many of you will necessarily be in the arts and cultural sector, but they're a really good hub of information about what is happening in that bit of the sector. And there are other similar portals across different EU networks, particularly, that you can find out what's happening. I know there's also, our government is currently in discussions about the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the funding that's going to replace the European Union funding that previously benefited places like Wales, where I'm based in Cardiff. So they're looking at the moment to consult about what the structures and responsibilities of that fund might be, because that's in theory meant to replace the many billions of pounds the European Union did bring to the UK in all the different areas. But yeah, obviously highly politicised, and particularly today, quite poignant, I think, on this date. A lot of you have just mentioned individual donors, crowdfunding, those kind of things. What I really want to stress here, and what I'm sure many of you already know, is that this obviously really varies. So this can be like major investment of like one-off donations from very wealthy people who want to be seen to support a cause, right the way down to, you know, individuals, people like us, other people giving, you know, what little they can whenever they can in all those different ways. So when we talk about donors, often that word might seem a bit like, you know, Bill and Melinda Gates type people, and actually, you know, we're donors if you give to charities or give to causes that you want to support. So yes, it could be really large sums, could be really small sums. It could be online. It might be, you know, PayPal button, a coffee button. You could have something like a Patreon, so they have access to people in the background that they want to be affiliated with or kind of engaged by. It might be in real life, people, you know, putting money in a bucket or collecting, or, you know, those kind of things. Could be a really regular thing. They might be donating, you know, regularly £1 or £2 or £50 or whatever, right the way through to a, you know, one-off donation. So I think at our peril, we lump all of these in together and think of them just as individual donors, but it's really worth thinking about like all the different people at different levels and different ways that they give and engage. And the best way, I think, to do that is really to think about how you do that and how other people you know do that. If you support things financially, if you're able to, what is that for you and why do you do it? What are your motivations? What are your habits? Ask other people about theirs, and then try and perhaps unpick some of that. It's quite useful just to kind of think those things through. One of the other ways I think somebody else has already put up is about legacies and bequests, so people who leave money in their will, which is also a really, really big way that many of them, certainly major charities, achieve quite a lot of their income targets. There's also membership, friends associations, so people who want to be affiliated to you and join your sort of mailing list, but mailing list plus, and they get access to certain information in advance or events or people that they would like to contact. So all of those I would lump in together with individuals, but as I say, they're really, really varied. Trusts and foundations, so you've already put a few in here, which is great. So some of the others that you've listed, I'm just looking back, Roundtrees and others. Again, foundations are and trusts are as varied as individuals. So some of them are really, really teeny tiny and they give away, you know, £200 or £500 here or there once in a while. Others are multi-billion pound behemoths who give away, you know, billions of pounds in, you know, 2 or 3 year windows to support whatever it is they're set up to do. So they're charitable causes set up to support other charitable causes. As I mentioned at the beginning, they are being massively impacted because most of them are by COVID and the financial investments and assets that they hold, because that is how most of them get their money. It's private money given by an individual usually, or a family, sometimes as a bequest or legacy from a will, and that money is invested and they spend the percentage return, the investment, but they don't touch the investment itself, they just spend the interest. So it's those kind of foundations that are struggling perhaps at the moment, some of them less so, depends how their endowments are run and so on, but really worth knowing they are very, very varied, from tiny ones right through to these huge ones as well. And there's, like I said, a few examples there you've given in chat, which is really great. Corporates is a really funny one. Oh, actually, I was going to mention my ethical thing right at the top of this, but I just forgot, I ran over it. With all of these, you do need to think about, and the reason I mentioned with corporates particularly is that I think you need to be really satisfied with all of these sources of money, how well aligned they are with what you do and how comfortable you feel receiving that, whether it's from an individual, a corporation, a trust or foundation, whoever. Like, where did they get their money from? What is the source of that? And so particularly with, just answering Miller's question, there isn't a slide on this particularly, but it's all in the handout. You'll get this emailed to you afterwards. So I'm just running through a list that I've got at the moment, and you'll get the copy of that list as we finish up the session today. So, so yeah, I was thinking about it particularly in relation to corporations, but one of the biggest trusts and foundations in the UK is called the Wellcome Trust. They have had most of their money gifted by Henry Wellcome, who earned most of his money through pharmaceuticals. And the Wellcome Foundation actually became part of GlaxoSmithKline. So many of the artists and academics that I work with will not accept that money because it has touched animal testing at some point in its life. So there are ethical things that we need to think about all the time, which I know many of you will be grappling with daily. It's not new news, but particularly with corporations, those big pots of money, and individuals, really think that through. How happy are you to receive this, and where does it come from? So yeah, I was going to say corporates and businesses could give you cash. There might be sponsorship money that they give you, but they're also quite likely to spend a percentage of their profits through what we call CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is how they make themselves look to be better employers, or to support their employees in their local area, or to kind of improve their image locally, or their level of engagement locally. So many of them either have in-house teams that give away a small amount of money. Some of them also have separate foundations, like Lloyds Bank have a Lloyds Bank Foundation, and they give a percentage of their profits to that. So sometimes look out for those arm's length bodies that are associated with businesses. So they could, like I say, donations, sort of financial support that way. It could be sponsorship, depending if there's an event, an activity that they want to align their brands with, and how comfortable, again, you feel with that, and what they want for the sponsorship can sometimes be quite demanding. And then finally, they could also offer you in-kind stuff. So things where otherwise you'd have to pay for it, but they make it available free to you. So they could be lending you something like access to a meeting room, or a piece of kit, or a team member. So it could be a voluntary contribution for staff members to be involved. And worth knowing, if you ever need solicitors, accountants, whatever, and for them to do things free, they don't call that in kind, normally they call it pro bono. So if you ever need to find a friendly solicitor or an accountant or somebody to do that, if you ask them for if they have any pro bono sort of time in-house, they're more likely to open up about whether they do or don't. A couple more here, and I'm just going to pick up a few more in the chat as well. So one I would say is around the free money that the government does give away is two very particular areas, but gift aid, if you run a registered charity or affiliated with a registered charity and you can get access to gift aid, is free money from the government, so well worth doing. And likewise, they have some tax reliefs for certain things like R&D, innovation, other pots. So again, depending on what you're doing, there may be things that it's worth talking to an accountant about, but they tend to be more around businesses, universities, cultural production. So some of the clients I work with get some of those reliefs for making new artworks, or those kind of things. A bit like the film industry gets tax reliefs for operating in this country, and those kind of things. So it is worth looking at if you're doing any of that stuff. But I'm just going to run through a couple more on my list and a couple more on your lists. So one is research councils. So the research councils exist to support the creation of new knowledge in the university and wider HE and innovation. So they exist across every different sector that is represented within HE, particularly in research. So you get the Medical Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and they support the creation of new knowledge, and they also have public engagement elements to that. So some of you who might be operating in particular areas might discover that they've got support or kind of funds that are going into certain things around those areas. Couple more that I'm going to pick out of this list that you've put up. Universities, definitely. Universities at the moment are telling me and others like me that they have less money than they've ever had in their lives, but they still have more money than most people that I work with. They're just relatively poorer now than they were 3 months ago, but really they're still relatively well off in terms of certainly buildings and resources, human resources, but sometimes cash as well. So well worth being in touch with them if you can to get any of those supports. I'm just checking your list that's down here in case there's any others that I've skipped over. I'm going to mention angel investors, which is a slight aside, but for some of you it's a bit like an individual donor, but somebody who wants to make social impact. So a bit like Dragon's Den, where they're doing that on TV as a kind of investment. They want a financial return, and there are angel investors who will do things like make donations or investments for social return. So many of them operate as just very wealthy donors, but you might find them called that, so it's worth perhaps knowing that phrase. But I've got a couple of others that are just worth mentioning. One, again, many of you will do both in the groups that you're affiliated with or in other activities, but what I would call traditional fundraising, where you might do sponsored things or bake sales or events or raffles or galas or other activities to raise money, and that people can donate and help support a cause that way. Whatever that is, that's a really brilliant way to raise money because it is very light touch relatively. You can spend as much or as little time on it as you like, and it's actually money that is much more flexible because you can decide how to choose to use that. Obviously, if you go into a funded relationship with a trust or a foundation or an investor of any other sort, they're going to want some sort of arrangement with you about what you've agreed to do and how that's going to work. Whereas if you raise your own funds through some of those activities, that can be a really brilliant thing to do in terms of the flexibility of the money being available to you. Excuse me. Final one that I'm just going to talk about is traded or earned income. I don't know if any of you do have like merchandise or services that you trade or other things, but that again is really flexible. A great way to think about and consider how you can grow that. So if you do sell tickets for things, if you've got merchandise, if you've got traded services, anything that goes around that, maybe you have a piece of kit or an expertise that you can run training that you can charge businesses for, or those kind of things. That's a brilliant source of income, or it can be, depending on what you do. I'm really aware that you're all probably doing very varied things, so some of this might be useful to you, some of it not. Any questions on any of that? I'm just aware of time and the fact that I'm just checking your list in case there's anything else on there that I've missed. Any other things I have missed that you want me to talk about that you put up in the chat? Or any questions on that generally? Great. Okay, shall I move on to the next bit? Everyone's still with us? Good, I'm aware it's the end of the afternoon. So I'm going to go on to share this next bit of this slide. So this is really starting to think about where you're talking about perhaps trusts and foundations, universities, research councils, the National Lottery and other lotteries, basically anywhere that you think you need to make an application. When I say make an application, this could actually be writing a letter. It might not be a formal application process, and we'll cover that in a second, but perhaps something that has more of a process where you need to not just approach an individual donor, but maybe put yourself into a process where there are other people competing for those funds, or other similar ways that you need to put through a step-by-step stage where you might get a yes or a no at the end of it. So particularly, like I say, grant trust making bodies, any of those individual lotteries, other of those. So I'm just going to cover on this slide and the next slide a few of these key points, and there's a lot more detail in the handout. So please don't worry if you don't catch all of this now, because you can kind of read through some of it later as well. My key thing is that I think we could all do is spending more time researching before we even start writing. So is this the right opportunity for you? How do you know that? How much do you know about, like I said, the ethically, the sources of the money, right the way through to what they're going to require of you if they do give you some money to support whatever it is you're up to. So all of that research is really useful. I'm going to talk in a second on the next slide about how you might do that and what you might want to know. I think bullet point 2 is also super important for me. So like being really realistic and planning as well in advance as you can, giving yourself more time than you can imagine, both to research before you apply, make the application, and then have to wait for them to come back to you, because often there is a gap between that. So for you to know how much you need to leave there for a deadline or a timeline. Definitely in this sort of realm that you guys are working in around activism, campaigning, any of those issues, I think we should think really laterally and creatively about to whom we're going and for what. And again, I'll pick up on that a little bit as we go through, but I'm not just assuming that the people we've always gone to are the best people to go to, and that perhaps some of those things that we've just crowdsourced and that longer list might be useful to you to diversify your funding and kind of reach out and find other opportunities to reach new people, enable new activities, whatever that is, with new pots of funding that weren't available to you before. Generally speaking, this was definitely true before, but it's even more true now. I'd say competition is quite stiff for most of these funds, because we know most local authorities have disinvested things that were not statutory services because austerity's played out the way it has over the last decade. Competition is quite stiff and you do need to stand out. So we'll talk a little bit today as we go through this about how to do that, but just be aware that you need to put yourself in the best possible position to get access to some of these funds. I definitely think 5 is important. Stay focused on your aims, know what you're about, know what you want to do, know who you're prepared to work with and what difference you're trying to achieve. It's very tempting when new pots of money pop up that seem similar but perhaps slightly different to what you're about, that we can kind of go off and chase after those rather than being committed to the core of what you're about. So really keep your eye on the ball with that and not just get distracted if a funder announces a new priority or a new foundation comes up. That we shouldn't necessarily chase after those. We should do our research first and find out if they're the right thing for us to do. And bullet point 6 here really is that most funders, whether they're individual donors or these bigger trusts and foundations, or in fact the smaller ones, are looking for this. They're looking for evidence of need and then potential for impact. It's a very short sentence to capture what they're about, but what is the need? How do you know this? How can you prove it, whether it's from your own experience and research or other people's data and information? Why are you the right people to be engaged around this? Why now? All of those kind of questions. What is the evidence of that need? And then if they're going to give you the money, what is the potential for impact? So what is going to be different because they invested that in you? So yeah, those are my kind of 6 key things to remember. Let me just have a quick look. The questions outlining the potential impact to the job of that, or both. I'm going to come to that in a sec. What's the possible position in your opinion? What does that look like for grass? Great. So I'm going to cover both of these in a second. So I'm just going to leave those to one side so I can come back to those. Thanks for both of those quick queries. I'm just going to show you this next slide because hopefully this is useful to answer a couple of those things in part, and then I can explain a bit more if it's not covered. So these top 2 here, really I'm not going to talk about at all, but they're just what I've suggested. You need to have a good idea of what is your vision, what is your idea, what is your ethos, what is your purpose, what are you about, what are you trying to do. And here I've called that business planning, but it could be just broadly like, what is your capacity to do this? Because fundraising takes an amount of time, and particularly in areas where perhaps as volunteers, not all of you will be, but as some of you will be definitely volunteering around some of this. So it's like where to spend the right amount of time on doing fundraising rather than doing activity and vice versa. So thinking about what resources and capacity you've got and knowing both of those before you start really. Then I'm just going to rattle through the rest of these bullet points. As I say, there's a lot more detail in the handout. But the first thing, as we just said, is I think you need to start with research. You need to know a lot about your opportunity that you've identified. In the handout I've given you, there's quite a few links about where some of these pots of money and grant databases are that are searchable, that you can go through and find out what the opportunities currently are, and particularly around trusts and foundations and public money. But there are other ways that you can find out. So one of the ways that I love finding out about new funders or new opportunities, like noticing where do other people get their money from. So if I'm at an event or talking to a colleague or another collaborator, like if they mention something that is new or something that I've not heard of before that is helping them financially in terms of fundraising, then I'm always really interested to like find out more about it and know, you know, who is that? Is that an individual donor, or is it a trust or foundation that I've not come across, or discover more about it? So, so like I said, this for me is where the labour is in the research. It's not really in the making the application, which does take an amount of effort to write or to create, but really in looking through everything and working out, is the funder the right fit, and are you the right fit for the funder? So the easiest way to explain that is that all of these people that we've just brought up, and the people in your suggestions list and the people I've just mentioned, none of those people give money away just for the sake of giving it away. They all give it away for the intention of something to be different, to make a change in the world, to have something happen because they gave that money. And so if I can only impress one thing on you today, it's to understand the motivation of the person or the organisation that's giving that money away. So what change are they wanting to see in the world? Where does their money come from? What are they about? And then when you make an application, you're thinking about how you are helping them achieve that change. So fundraisers call this making the funder the hero. And it's a bit of a clunky phrase, but it kind of implies like too often we make our projects or our activity or ourselves the heroes, like, hey, I've got this great thing, I can help you. Really, we're helping them achieve their vision, their ethos, their purpose, their agenda. And it's when we can align that really well that I think we're more likely to be successful, which is why I think you need to spend quite a lot of time thinking about the research end of it, to know that you do feel like you've got a really good fit here. Between the opportunity that you've identified and then the reality of actually starting to think about applying. So I'm really briefly just going to say some of the things that you'd want to know at this stage, like particularly about grant funding through trusts and foundations, but any opportunity really is like, how much money is there? Are there any deadlines? How long will they take to get back to you? Have they got grant ceilings? Like, are they only giving away up to £5,000? Are they only giving away over £5,000? What are their eligibility and criteria? So the basic things of like, do you have to be based in the UK, or do you have to be based or operating in a certain region or area that you can prove? All of those kind of things that you would need to pick up on. And then also these criteria. So it's like, what's the purpose of the money, but also are there any conditions on that? So things like, we never pay for equipment, or we won't ever cover staff costs, or any of those things. So exclusions and other things to consider. And it's all of that information that really is helping you decide that you found the right opportunity to make an application. And as I say, making an application could be very different. It doesn't mean just using an online form to kind of type in a proposal and upload a budget and off you go. That is definitely the most common format for these things, but it's not the only way by a long shot. So some of you might have had dealings with either individual donors or trusts and small trusts and foundations especially, who like to receive like letters, quite often printed and sent in an envelope with a stamp on, which is quite unusual. Some of them have hard deadlines. For some of those, you have to have sent it by a certain date and the postmark be a certain date. Excuse me. Some of them might have a two-stage process. So they might have an initial process, which is a stage one, a short application or a summary application, which might be quite small, with the idea that they'll read however many of those arrive and then whittle that down and offer a second stage application to work up a full version only to those that have been successful in getting over the first hurdle. And the reason they're doing that, just to be really clear, is to help their own resources in-house, because you imagine they're having to read, say, 100 full applications for a grant round or 1,000 full applications for a grant round. They might actually be wanting to try and be a bit savvy to not have to do that and only read 25 when they've shortlisted those 25. But also they're actually helping us out. And I know that's kind of hard to believe, but they do want to help us out and make life a bit easier for us if possible. So they'll be, for instance, thinking, well, that's good because we don't all have to write 100 applications to the fullest extent, which obviously saves us time and money as well. So yeah, lots of different things there about the application process itself. Like I said, they vary a lot, so it's worth just checking they're not all just online forms. And then, of course, you're either successful or you're not. And this is the point that I like to just reiterate, that actually it's quite an emotional process, fundraising, especially for a cause or a campaign that your heart is very vested in. It's really quite difficult sometimes to get a no, because you feel like you've put everything into something. You think you've done your good research, you found a really good match, you've made the best application. So to get a no can be really dispiriting. And I think we should just remember that, because the emotional arc of applying for these sorts of pots can be quite difficult for some people. The other end of that is when you get a no, please, if you can, always ask for feedback from the organisation or the individual. Not all of them offer it, but if they do offer it, try and read that feedback or hear that feedback and understand what was it that wasn't quite right, and try and learn from that so that you can kind of bring that into your next application, whether it's to them or to someone else. The other extreme is obviously when you get a yes, having put all of this work and effort in. It's an amazing thing. It's a really great feeling and a genuine moment to celebrate, I think. Also comes with the slight caveat that quite often I've worked on big applications with charities, individuals, and really excited that we get the money. And it's not long, perhaps a couple of days after, that we get an email or a grant offer or whatever, and that we suddenly go, what did we actually say we do? Like, oh, did we say we do 100 workshops? That sounds like quite a lot, So the sort of fear of what you've written and what we call be careful what you wish for. You've made it sound so impressive and exciting that someone wants to invest in it or support it. So just be aware that there is that caveat of not over promising and not being too ambitious. You need to be ambitious enough to secure it, but not so ambitious that you're terrified about having to deliver it now someone actually does believe in you, wants to give you the money. So yeah, as I say, that application, whatever you've written, usually then comes down to agreeing terms and conditions if you're successful, and that usually becomes a legal contract. So again, worth knowing what you're agreeing to at that point in terms of crediting a funder or a supporter, making sure that you're reporting to them in the right way and that you've got all the materials and things lined up that they're expecting, and that you know what is expected of you. And then finally, towards the bottom of that slide, you actually get to do the thing that you wanted to do when you set off at the beginning. So I deliberately labour that a bit, but those that for me are all the really key stages in the process. I think it's not always intuitive to people that don't work in fundraising or don't do a lot of fundraising, that, like I say, spending more time in the research stage to get a really good fit between the opportunity and what you're trying to do can help increase your success. But also that, like I say, many funders want quite a lot from you. So maybe some of the things that we just came up with in terms of even crowdfunding or individual donations, or some of those traditional fundraising routes like holding an event or putting on a charity gig, or some of those other things might raise you similar sums actually to smaller trusts and foundations and smaller grant applications, but there might be less labour in doing some of that organising and working out of that than there is in doing some of these things, given the nature of having to write applications. I'm just gonna, one more thing, show you this, and then I'll just come back to these questions. So there's the thing that I've mentioned already about timeframe and milestones. So just making sure that you have enough time built in from when you want to start your activity or your campaign or your whatever it is, working backwards. And the easiest way to explain this is if you're only looking for one funder to come in, or one supporter or one donor to come in, then actually their time frame is kind of paramount and you work within that. The trick is if you're working with perhaps 2 or 3 funders or donors or supporters, you're running perhaps a crowdfunder and engaging an individual donor and also having a fundraising event and applying to a trust or a foundation. They may all have very different timeframes from when you apply to when you get a decision. So you'll need to factor all of that in as you're working through this. questions about budgets, there's never enough time. In 90 minutes we don't have enough time to really talk about budgets, but the key things that I want to point out, will they make a contribution to your core costs, your overheads, your management fees, full cost recovery, however you want to talk about those things, but basically will they help you pay for being existing and doing what you do, the core things that you have to have. Is there a cap on that? So they might cap it at 5, 10, 20%, but if you can recover some of those costs in a fundraising application or a supporter bid, well worth doing that, obviously. Definitely make sure you build in some contingency to your project budgets. Funders like to see that, or donors like to see that, because things rarely, if ever, work out exactly as you were expecting. So at least a 5% contingency on anything like that. Really make sure that you've thought about, and I'm sure most of you do already, but thinking about access, particularly for disabled people or more marginalised and underrepresented groups. So what do you need to do in terms of budgets there that would make your activity or whatever more accessible? Have you got any other cash match funding that you can bring into this? Or is there any in-kind match funding that you can bring to? So like I say, voluntary donations of equipment, time, space, kit, whatever that might be. So yeah, a little nod there to budgets. I might come back to that in a sec if there are any questions. Last two things on this slide, and I'll come back and pause. One is about communication. So just letting funders know when things are going well, definitely be in touch with them, not just to do the minimum, like returning the grant paperwork or reporting anything to them that they require. But it's nice to send them little clips of good press or PR or successful campaigning or an invite to an event that you're holding or whatever that might be, so that you're in touch with them, not really regularly, but once in a while. Communication is also really important when things are not going well. So if you took my example before when I said, you know, crikey, maybe we said we were going to do 100 workshops, and that suddenly sounds like, oh, I can't do 100 workshops, it's too hard. I would definitely go back to a funder or a donor and talk to them and let them know, you know, we're struggling already to think about how to meet this output target or this outcome from the project because, you know, whatever the reasons are, maybe you've had someone go off sick, maybe a key partner or collaborator's pulled out, maybe something's stalled for some reason. So explaining to them before you get to the end of the project or the end of the activity, what it is that's changing, and kind of keeping in touch rather than burying your head in sand, ignoring the problem and just telling them about it when you get to the final reporting. Final point here on this slide is, I think, really relevant. I was talking with a colleague this morning in arts and culture and heritage about this. Just that if you find an opportunity that feels like it's really closely matched to everything you do, but the stumbling block is the governance status. So quite a lot of trusts and foundations and other funders and donors will only fund certain organisations. They'll only fund registered charities, say, or only fund not-for-profits or social enterprises or whatever. So if you're an individual or you're constituted differently, like you're an informal constituted group or a community group or whatever, you might feel like you're shut out from some of those opportunities. But just to say that I really encourage you to go off and try and create mutually beneficial partnerships, collaborations, co-productions with other partners who have a different governance status to you, different legal status to you. So if you're, say, a community association, go find a registered charity that you think you can partner up with, and that they can be the vehicle for you making applications. So it's finding sort of workarounds. Like I said, I don't do that very often. I do it mainly when there is a genuine stumbling block. It's like everything else about this is perfect, but we don't have a registered charity, so we can't apply. Then I would go and find somebody who has that criteria so that it's exactly matched. So yeah, that's my kind of whistle-stop tour. I'm just sort of summary of everything we've just said, which is make sure that you read the guidance that either a donor sends or that a business has produced for their CSR, or that a trust and foundation produces or a lottery funder produces. I know it feels a bit like you might have to read every website page on their website and every 75 pages of their annual report and their PDF that they produce and the FAQs and whatever. The reason they do that is to try and help us out. I know it seems unbelievable that they think that producing that amount of information might help, but what they're trying to do is give us everything that we need to know before we consider if we're the right opportunity for them and vice versa. So do make sure you read it if they publish it. do really, and it's a really clunky sentence now I look at it, but I've put sell your work in your organisation, and like really be passionate about what it is that you do, and really push that and celebrate it and be proud of it, because it's those things that stand out in applications. Nobody is going to be writing well, I hope you'd never write an application that's like, I think it's going to be okay, we might be all right. You've got to kind of own it a bit and be proud of what you do, and really get that out there, so that the people who are reading it and making those decisions are really as invested as you are in that. In a second, we're going to talk about exactly this. So think about how you go about writing it. What do you include? What do you leave out? And is it okay to use acronyms, jargon, sector-specific language, things like that? So we'll talk about that in a second. And again, who should write it? Most of us don't have anyone else that we can lean on. We're responsible for this either in our networks or in our groups, or just an individual and having to do this. So there often isn't anyone else that you can officially involve, but I'm going to talk a little bit about other people who might be around that you could draw in to help you with some of it. And my final one there is just this reminder of, like, don't chase the money. Just chasing the money is a terrible thing to do, I think, because you do end up having to twist and turn and end up in some slightly weird places just because somebody said, oh, we've got a new fund or a new priority, and suddenly everyone's interested in it because there's money over there. So I know that's unlikely for most of you, because many of you are so committed to the cause, the campaign, the activity that you do. But occasionally you see it happen, and charities particularly might end up in odd positions. They're not fulfilling their charitable objectives and other things because they're just chasing after pots of funding that have been announced. So I'm just gonna, yeah, here we are. I'm gonna run through, and that's the abstract version of it, I suppose. I've just shared with you the kind of, here's the stages in theory. And what I'm going to do over the next 2 slides is just tell you what I actually do when I come across an opportunity that works for me or for a group that I'm working with or an individual. And so this slide at the front here is just to say what I'm doing is finding out about where that opportunity might be, and then researching it to find out much more about that one thing, like, is this a good opportunity and a good fit for us? And then I'm capturing that information because I don't want to waste it. I want to hang on to it so I can refer back to it writing this application, but also so that I can maybe think about reapplying in the future. I want to hold on to the things that I found out. So making some notes, putting that in a notebook, on a Google sheet, or storing it somehow so that you don't just do all that research and then kind of forget about it, where you're going to kind of put it to one side. And these, the other things here is just really my working assumptions on this process. I'm assuming it's like the equivalent of a trust or foundation application, or to perhaps to a university or a research council, to a lottery fund or something like that, where there is a bit of a process and you have to fill in an application form or write a proposal and make that to them. So I'm making sure I've read all the guidance for their word limits, their help notes, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm assuming here that it's an online application that we're going to be filling in, and that we might need to upload some attachments to go with it. So maybe there's a letter of support or a testimonial. Maybe you need to supply a budget, which is almost always on their templates. They want it in their versions, not in yours. Whoops. And then maybe you need to include some other stuff. You might need to include up to the last 3 years worth of accounts, or a copy of some insurance or something. So a bunch of things. So I'm assuming, imagining all of this, I found the best opportunity. I've done all the reading and background research. I know it's an online form, and I've got a couple of attachments. So this is what I would actually do in this scenario. And this is a really ugly slide. It's got way more information. On one slide, but it's a good reminder of, like, in one slide, this is what I do. So I do a bit of a timeline, starting with the detail of when do I need the money to land, what date is that, and then I work backwards from that in their timeline. So how long will it take them to get back to me? When is the deadline? You know, or any of those things that I'm working through backwards, and then forwards, like, once I've got the money, when can I do the prep and everything else to get ready, and then when is the delivery going to start? And then added to that, I'm going to do like a shopping list of what I need for the application. So I might write down, like, I need to register on their online portal. I need to get a copy of the insurance certificate or last year's accounts. I need to get a letter of support or a testimonial from somebody. I need to write the detail of the application proposal. So there might be, you know, a number of questions I have to answer on that form. So it's those kind of things. So sort of make a timeline and a shopping list of like what it is that the application itself needs. I'm almost always headed for the deadline. If there is a hard deadline, at least the day before. So if somebody says the deadline was today at 5 o'clock, I'd be trying to submit it yesterday, just to avoid those classic things of like a portal crashing, or you forgetting your password and not being able to get logged in, or somebody not sending you the information in time, so you have to chase them, any of that stuff. So just giving yourself as much time as possible before the deadline so that you can submit. Then I'm going on to register on their online portal if I've never registered with them before. In some cases that might take a couple of days for them to like verify your email address and get you set up on that online application portal. Then I'm also checking that I've got many of the documents or the things that they might want me to send to them. So things like copies of insurance or accounts from previous years. And in that useful folder, I'm also keeping things that, well, I'm going to say in a bit, don't copy and paste anything from one form to another, but do copy and paste some stuff. So you might want to know things like if you've got a charity registered number or company limited number or those kind of things, you might want to have those all to hand. You might have biogs of the organisation or key individuals or CVs of people or any of that kind of stuff so that you've got it to hand somewhere and you know that you've got it. Then I'm actually going out to ask other people for their support around these attachments and getting these sorted if I need them to. So if I need a testimonial or a letter of support to endorse me or the organisation, if I need someone else to provide me a copy of the accounts, like I don't happen to have those and I need to chase someone from them, so I'm going out to do all of that. Which really shows that I do all the other stuff before I start writing anything. So I would basically project manage the hell out of the first like 5 bullet points and then and only then start writing stuff. And in a second, we'll talk about the technique of writing and like some tips that might be useful. But the way that I would approach it broadly, I would set up either a Word doc or a Google doc or a Pages doc or whatever you use. And I would cut and paste over the questions or the headings from the application form and probably put them one per page so that I can see them clearly. So like question 1 is just one blank page, question 2, new page, question 3 and so on. Just to see which ones I've already added material into or give me a bit of editing space. And then I'm starting to probably bullet point in some ideas, thoughts, questions, comments, probably even just to myself, not even creating content yet. I might just be jotting down like, oh, I don't know why they've even asking this question, or what does the word impact mean? Or why are they interested in policy? What has policy got to do with this funder or whatever? So noting down ideas and probably starting to have a chat with anybody else that I can. So maybe other collaborators, other volunteers, other people who are around that I can involve in this somehow. So yeah, any previous participants or previous collaborators or anybody else you can sort of even have a quick chat with. In the old days, I'd go out and like buy somebody a coffee and sit down with them and kind of pick their brains about something. So yeah, just any way that you can involve anybody. I would also then make sure that whatever you do, there is only one person that writes the form. I know that's really tempting to say that most of us don't have the luxury of having anyone else to bring in, but actually you can really tell when we've split an application form up between us. Like I wrote question 1 and Safa wrote question 2 and Kay wrote question 3. It's horrible. It's really horrible to read.
You finished
So just bear that in mind. Because it's really grim. Just going to meet Nitya. Sorry, she's just come back in. I think she's struggling with her audio connection. So yeah, just one writer. Then I would really be thinking about, like I say, when I've collected all these thoughts and bullet points and different headings under different questions, I'd really spend a bit of time, if you're not used to doing this, thinking about what is your best time and process to write. When do you like to write? When do you not like to write? What conditions do you like to write in? So some people like to write when there's lots of background noise and they can just kind of put the headphones in and ignore everything and get on with it. Some people like having a whole day that's free in their diaries that they can just sit down and kind of immerse themselves in that. Some of you, that is like your worst nightmare and that you want like 20 minutes a day to just try and tackle a small bit every day so you feel like you've bitten off some small chunks towards the total. So I can't answer that for you. You have to work out for yourselves what the best time and process is for you to write this stuff. But I do think it obviously really helps, because your best time and process to write is going to be your best writing. So I'll talk about writing in a second, the technical things. My final tip really is so obvious it's almost not worth saying, but that's why I'm going to share it, is to get someone else to read it. So get anybody else that you can to read it. And we're not asking them to critique it and say it's good or it's bad. Get them to read it and ask you questions is a really great way of getting feedback. So ask them what they understood, what they thought about, get them to describe back to you what they think the activity is, or get them to ask you questions about it. So like, what does this mean? Or why does it say that? Or how is that going to work? Or that doesn't seem clear, or you've mentioned this, but I don't understand it, or whatever. So that is really useful for you to understand what you've really got across, what you've conveyed, and whether it's landing with somebody. And it's a really nice way just to check text. But it relies on two things. It relies on you having somebody to ask and also having some time to do it. And that's obviously really difficult because many of us don't have other people to ask, and sometimes we're working to really short deadlines. So the other thing you can do obviously is leave it and come back to it. You could try and leave it overnight and look at it again tomorrow, or leave it over a weekend and come back and look at it next week. And then you've got sort of fresher eyes to look at it. But my final one, which is a really useful trick, is either to read it out loud to yourself, which does make you seem a bit unusual, shall we say, in terms of like housemates or other people that you work with might be like, why are you in the empty office reading out loud to yourself? Or why are you standing in the bedroom reading out loud to yourself? There's something about your brain hearing the words, which is different to your eyes scanning the text. And you can understand that you've overused the word brilliant. You've said it 17 times in that paragraph or whatever. Or that you started a paragraph with one intention, you didn't really land it in the writing. You can tell when it's a bit clunky. The other great thing is that most software, word processing software now has screen readers built in, so you can get Google or Word or others to do this for you. So if you want your computer to read it back to you while you listen, rather than doing it out loud yourself, that is another option. So I offer that in the hope that it's useful. I resisted adding this in for quite a lot of years when people would ask me, well, what do you do, Laura? How does that work for you? The reason that I add it in is in the hope there might be some hints and tips and tricks in there that might work for you. But please, goodness, if they're not, if it doesn't work for you and this is like, oh, I wouldn't do it like that, I do it like this, like, fine, do it the way you need to do it. But maybe there's some bits in there that might be useful for you to think about. I'm going to just give an example of a question that you might get asked in a formal document or a formal process like we're talking about. So this is actually an example question from Paul Hamlin Foundation, who are quite a big UK funder. We also support work in India because of the historic connection that Paul Hamlin himself had with India. It's a question which is only 400 words. And when I say only 400 words, I'm really aware that for some of us, 400 words is like, well, how much is that anyway? So it's about a page of A4. Some of you are probably thinking, I don't have a page of A4 in me to answer this. I wouldn't know where to start with 400 words to answer this. And others of you are probably thinking, I could never answer that in 400 words. I'd need 3,000. But this is the challenge that we're wrestling with, particularly when we're given an application form with set questions and set word limits. Obviously, if you're given a proposal and you can write whatever you like, or you can send a business plan or an organisational plan, that's very much more in your own gift. But when it's somebody else's form and their word limits, it's these kind of questions that we might be trying to jam our word count down. And so I'm just going to do a little bit on writing tips and some basics that might help, because I know when we run this as a full day, I give about 45 minutes in the afternoon for people to have a chance to have a go at writing something. Because actually what I discovered, like many of you know, that much of this is just about practice and confidence and learning how to word things and how confident you feel. Like many things in life, like any skill in life, is like learning and practicing. So writing and funding is exactly the same. So I'm just going to share my screen for the last time with a couple of these points on, and then we'll finish up with one overview slide and talk about the handouts that you're going to get as well. So the top 2 bullet points on this slide are really the ones that I think are the most important, and everything else is like the icing on the cake. So it's to even, bullet point 1 there is just to acknowledge that we all, whether we like it or not, we already have a writing style or a tone or a voice. Some of us try to control that more, especially in more formal settings or in things like funding applications where we feel there's a kind of right way to write. But in my experience as a funding assessor, when I work sometimes for funding bodies to help them look at applications and advise on them, the ones that stand out are actually the ones where you can almost hear the person's voice. Sometimes you can even hear almost like that accent or the sort of pattern of their speech coming across in the text, and they're so memorable because they're much more distinctive. If you write in this kind of much more formal third person kind of structured way that people feel they should, perhaps sometimes that isn't doing us the best service. So kind of just acknowledge that you have a writing style and try and work with it is my big thing with that. The only other thing that I really would love you to remember off this slide is this second one about mirroring. Everything else is a bonus, like I say. So the mirroring thing is really, I'm hoping that whether it was an individual donor or a business or a grant founder, a grant funder or anybody else, that you'll have learned in the research process quite a lot about the people that you are applying to, whether they're an organisation or an individual. And maybe it's canny to sort of reflect back or mirror back some of their key words or key phrases to them. Funders, particularly formal funders like grant funders, find it really reassuring that you've just even read their information. So to give an example of this, I work quite a lot in the performing arts, and particularly with a collective of artists who are movement-based artists, physical artists. They do everything from theatre, dance, circus, all sorts of other things. And we've been working with a funder that has consistently over the last 2 years used the phrase making a step change in blah, blah, blah. So everything that we've spoken to them about and written to them about and involved with them about, I've been using the word step change somewhere in that so that they understand that we have definitely read and connected with what it is they're about. And it comes back to this kind of, the thing I said early on, making sure you understand what is the funder about, where's their money coming from, what's their motivation. And then how do you fit yourself alongside that and help them do that rather than the other way around. So mirroring across a couple of keywords that they use consistently to describe themselves or describe the schemes that they run, or their concerns or their motivations can be really comforting to a funder to read that, whether it's an individual donor or a more formal trust or foundation sort of process. A few others that I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll just pick out a few others. Using bullet points is a really, really helpful thing, especially if you feel intimidated by trying to write 400 words of like full text. Don't be afraid to use some bullet points to sort of break your text up a bit and just kind of get across using fewer words. I mean, that helps with your word count, but it might also just help those of us who feel less confident about creating kind of 400 words of text in that way, to kind of use bullet points to do that. I would definitely say funder, I mentioned briefly each of these actually. So story and stats. Story is like narrative based anything. So is there a case study? Is there an example, something that you can tell them about that either you're intending to do or you have done that is relevant? But never do that without making sure you also have some stats, some demographic information, some kind of proof, the evidence of need thing again, where, you know, where is the research behind this or where is the need behind this? So if you can include some numbers as well as a kind of narrative version, I think that's really comforting. Definitely focus, I mean, you have to establish your credentials or track record or potential. So you do need to say how you got to where you are now, but a funder is never funding you to do that in the past. If anybody is only giving you money to do things in the future. And again, this almost sounds too obvious to say out loud, but they will fund you to do things tomorrow, next week, next year, and they're not funding you for what you did 25 years ago or last week. So although the credentials are really important, it's the we are going to, we will be sort of language that is future facing, and that's why they're supporting you. The for example note there is to say sometimes we end up writing text which is not that understandable to somebody, maybe not that immediate, and one way to get past that so that it's not just we're going to plan this amazing event, it's going to do X, Y, Z, is actually give them an example. So instead of just talking yourself up or your organisation up or the activity up, root it back into, you know, we're brilliant at doing this, this is how we've worked for the last 25 years or whatever, and for example we won this award. Or you could say, you know, we're in the next 12 months we're going to do this, this and this with your money, but to give an example for each of these, you know, the training element, we're going to work with 100 primary schools or whatever. So you're giving them an example, and again it's kind of making it a bit more concrete and a bit more realistic and a bit more understandable. The one here that I've put about know your reader, I think is really important. And by that, I don't mean know exactly who the person reading it is, like the individual, but have in your mind who the person might be, the sort of person they are, and what they know about. So if they regularly fund things in your area of campaigning, activism, practice, whatever, then great. Feel free to use jargon and acronyms that they will understand. But if they are not used to funding things in your area, whatever that is, then make sure that you're clear with them and that you try and get rid of any of the things that we use as shorthand between yourself, whatever that is. So I'll just give, actually I was working with some musicians the other day, and I'll just give an example from music. I work a lot with musicians. And one of the things we might do is use technical musical jargon if we're writing to a music funder. Then that's totally fine. I would expect a funder to understand the word repertoire. And that just means the music we're going to play in the concert. But unless you're into music or unless you know musical jargon and acronyms, why would you know that? So if a musician wrote to a community funder about a big new songwriting project they were going to do with a community, if they then said, oh, the repertoire for the concert will include, like, why would that community funder know what that word means? And maybe it's quite alienating, quite excluding to use language that they don't understand. So always think about the level of assumed knowledge, what we're bringing in and what we know, which isn't always immediately apparent to anyone else. So that's a good example of where if you've got somebody to read it before you submit it, that can help root some of that out, but also helps just knowing in your head, you know, is this a funder that works in my area? If I use a bit of healthcare jargon, or if I use a bit of legal jargon, will they understand it? Or will it not be apparent to them because they don't normally work in these areas? I think that's probably enough for that slide. There's a couple of things there, but they're kind of relatively sophisticated. I'm not going to go through them because I don't think it's going to help you. I'm just going to do this and then check if there's any other questions because we're coming up to the end. So my sort of finalies, I suppose, the first thing is look out for what I would call double funding, what people call double funding, which is a nice problem to have, but it is a problem still. So imagine that you had a funding target of £5,000 and you wrote lots of different applications to lots of different people and you ended up raising more than £5,000. What you need to do then is not just bank the cheque and pretend it never happened. Apart from this, if you're a trustee of a charity, it's fraud. Even if you're constituted as a voluntary association, you can get into a lot of trouble individually for things like this. What I would do if you exceed your fundraising target, and you can end up doing that, I know some of us have probably in the past, go back to those supporters and funders and say to them, this is brilliant. You know, we've been so successful in achieving all of these people's investment and support around the project or the activity that actually we've got more than we need. Can we find a way to work with you to extend the project, do more things better, document it really well, you know, whatever it is that you want to add on. And in my experience, most of them will say yes to something like that. No two funders are the same, so do not copy and paste information across from one funder's application to another, however tempting that might be, as a shortcut and as a quick way to do it. The salutary lesson there is that if you were applying for a job, like if you're applying for a job at Neon, I hope you wouldn't send the same covering letter than if you were applying for a job at, I don't know, McDonald's or wherever. It's like knowing who is the person that is reading it and knowing that you're responding to the equivalent of the job spec and the person spec and all the things that would go to. So you're writing something that is for them, that you're not just copying and pasting over answers from previous funding applications. But do draw on this bank of information, like I say, try and have some stuff to hand. Most of us cannot afford a professional bid writer or external fundraiser. Some of you might have access to those people in-house, which is amazing if you do. But also if you want an external eye, sometimes a good way and a much more affordable way to use a fundraiser or a bid writer is not to pay them to do the whole thing, but to engage them to perhaps proof the first draft or proof a second draft of a bigger application once you've worked it up. So you might then just pay them an hour or a bit more of their rate to read through it and give you some feedback on what needs to be changed or what their questions are or what they think. So much cheaper, better value way than actually going out and trying to find somebody to do this for you, which, to be honest, most of us don't have that kind of cash to do anyway. Just a reminder there that, like I said earlier, sort of we've been trying to revisit over all of this, but like when you're looking for anybody to support you, whether it's an individual or a corporation or a foundation or whatever, most of those are looking for evidence of need and potential for impact.